In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where the streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns and picket fences, there was one house that stood out like a sore thumb. It was at the end of the street, its windows boarded up, its roof sagging and its once white paint now a patchy gray. The house had been abandoned for over a year. Ever since the horrific murder of the family who lived there, Mr. and Mrs. Carter and their two young children, Emily and Lucas. The killer was never caught, and the bodies of the family were never found. The case went cold, but the house remained a grim reminder of the tragedy. For 12-year-old Ethan, the house was both fascinating and terrifying. He lived right next door, and every night, as he lay in bed, he would hear faint screams coming from the abandoned house. They weren't loud, but they were unmistakable, agonized cries that sent chills down his spine. His parents dismissed it as his imagination, but Ethan knew better. Something was wrong with that house. One night, Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He had to know what was happening. He waited until his parents were asleep, grabbed a flashlight and sneaked out of his house. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the neighborhood as he approached the Carter house. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Ethan pushed it open, his heart pounding. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay. The floor was covered in a layer of dust, but as Ethan shone his flashlight around, he noticed something strange. The walls and floor were stained with what looked like fresh blood. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The murders had happened over a year ago, so why was the blood still wet? Ethan's flashlight flickered as he made his way deeper into the house. The screams were louder now, echoing through the empty rooms. He followed the sound to a door in the hallway, the basement door. It was slightly open and a cold draft wafted up from below. Ethan hesitated, but his curiosity got the better of him. He descended the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. The basement was dark and damp, the air heavy with the stench of rot. Ethan's flashlight flickered again, and for a moment, he thought he saw movement in the shadows. He shone the light around, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There, lying on the floor, were the bodies of the Carter family. Their faces were pale and lifeless, their clothes stained with blood. But the most horrifying part was their expressions, frozen in terror as if they had died screaming. Ethan's hands trembled as he stepped closer, his flashlight shaking. Then one of the bodies moved. Ethan's breath hitched as Mrs. Carter's head turned slowly toward him. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, and her lips curled into a grotesque smile. Ethan stumbled back, tripping over his own feet. He dropped the flashlight, and in the darkness he heard the sound of movement, slow, shuffling footsteps coming toward him. He didn't wait to see more. Ethan bolted up the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't stop running until he was back in his house, slamming the door shut behind him. He called 911, his voice shaking as he told the operator what he had seen. The police arrived the next morning. Ethan led them to the basement, but when they got there, the bodies were gone. The bloodstains were still there, fresh and glistening, but there was no sign of the Carters. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, and one of them turned to Ethan. "Are you sure you saw bodies down here?" he asked. Ethan nodded, his face pale. "They were here. I swear." The officer sighed. "The thing is, when the Carters were killed, their bodies were never found. The killer must have taken them. But if what you're saying is true, how did they end up back here?" Ethan didn't have an answer. He just stood there, staring at the empty spot where the bodies had been, his mind racing. That night, Ethan lay in bed, unable to sleep. The screams from the house had stopped, but now he had a new problem: nightmares. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mrs. Carter's smiling face, her lifeless eyes staring into his soul. He woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. The next day, Ethan decided to solve the mystery himself. He sat at his desk, scribbling notes and drawing diagrams, trying to piece together what had happened. He came up with a theory: maybe the Carters hadn't died that night. Maybe they had survived the attack and had been hiding in the basement all this time. But if that was true, why had they looked so dead? And why had they disappeared again? Ethan began researching the Carter family, digging through old news articles and police reports. He learned that the Carters had been well liked in the community, but they had kept to themselves. There were rumors that Mr. Carter had been involved in something shady, but no one knew for sure. Ethan also discovered that the house had a history of strange occurrences long before the murders. Previous owners had reported hearing whispers, seeing shadows, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Ethan's theory started to take shape. What if the Carters hadn't been killed by a random intruder? What if they had been targeted because of something they knew, or something they had? And what if their bodies had been hidden in the basement all along, only to reappear when the house wanted them to? One evening, Ethan found an old journal in the town library. It belonged to a historian who had studied the neighborhood's past. In it, there was a passage about the Carter house. According to the historian, the land the house was built on had once been a burial ground for victims of a deadly epidemic in the 1800s. The historian speculated that the ground was cursed, and anyone who built on it would suffer the same fate as those buried there. Ethan's heart raced as he read the passage. Could the house be cursed? Could the Carters' murders and the strange occurrences be connected to the land itself? He didn't know, but he was determined to find out. That night, Ethan returned to the Carter house one last time. He brought a camera, a voice recorder, and a sense of determination. As he stepped inside, the air felt heavier than ever. The whispers were back, faint but unmistakable. Ethan made his way to the basement, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The bodies were back, lying exactly where he had seen them before. But this time they weren't still. They were moving, their limbs twitching, their heads turning toward him. Ethan froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Mrs. Carter's lifeless eyes locked onto his, and her lips curled into that same grotesque smile. Ethan closed his eyes, waiting for the end, but nothing happened. When he opened his eyes, the bodies were gone. All he saw was an empty basement. The whispers had stopped, and the air felt lighter, as if the house had exhaled. Ethan stood there for a moment, his heart pounding. Had it all been in his head? Was the stress and fear playing tricks on him? He couldn't be sure. But as he climbed the stairs and left the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching him. Ethan never went back to the Carter house. The police eventually boarded it up for good, and the case remained unsolved. The bloodstains were still there, but no one could explain how they stayed fresh. Ethan's theory didn't make sense to anyone, not even himself. But he couldn't let it go. He spent hours researching, trying to find answers, but the more he learned, the more questions he had. One thing was certain: the house next door was cursed. And as long as it stood, Ethan knew he would never be free of the nightmares. In a quiet, forgotten town surrounded by dense forests, there stood an old, decrepit house. The locals called it the House of Echoes, because strange sounds always seemed to emanate from within, whispers, footsteps, and faint cries that no one could explain. The house had been abandoned for decades, its windows boarded up, its roof sagging, and its front porch littered with broken furniture. But the strangest thing about the house wasn't its appearance. It was the way it seemed to call to people. Every night, as the moon rose high in the sky, faint whispers could be heard coming from the house. Some said it was the wind. Others claimed it was the spirits of those who had disappeared inside. But no one dared to investigate, until one brave, curious girl named Eliza decided to uncover the truth. Eliza had always been fascinated by the stories of the House of Echoes. She was the kind of girl who loved solving mysteries, and the whispers were the greatest mystery of all. One moonlit night, she packed a flashlight, a notebook, and a small knife, just in case, and set off for the house. As she approached, the whispers grew louder. They weren't in any language she could understand, just faint, eerie murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. Eliza took a deep breath and pushed open the front door. It creaked loudly, and the whispers stopped abruptly, as if the house was holding its breath. Inside, the air was cold and heavy. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floor was littered with broken glass and debris. Eliza shone her flashlight around, her heart pounding. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. There was no response, just silence. The next night, Eliza returned, determined to uncover the source of the whispers. This time, she brought a voice recorder, hoping to capture the eerie sounds. As she stepped inside, the whispers began again, louder and more urgent than before. She pressed record and held her breath. The whispers seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. Eliza pressed her ear against the cold, damp surface and listened closely. This time she could make out words, her name. Eliza. Eliza, stay with us. She jumped back, her heart racing. Who's there? She demanded, her voice trembling. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Eliza, join us, become one of us. Eliza turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her. She pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers were everywhere now, filling the room, echoing in her mind. She covered her ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside her head. Eliza didn't return the next night. Her family searched for her, but there was no trace of her in the house, just her flashlight and voice recorder lying on the floor. When they played the recording, all they heard was static and faint whispers. A week later, a group of teenagers decided to investigate the house. They had heard about Eliza's disappearance and wanted to prove they were braver than her. But as they entered, the whispers began again, louder and more menacing than ever. One by one, the teenagers vanished, their screams echoing through the house before being swallowed by the whispers. The only thing left behind was a single note, written in shaky handwriting: "The walls are alive." Years later, a historian named Dr. Carter came to the town, determined to solve the mystery of the House of Echoes. He spent weeks researching the house's history and discovered that it had once been owned by a reclusive doctor who had conducted unethical experiments on patients in the early 1900s. The doctor had been obsessed with the idea of capturing human consciousness, and he had used the house as his laboratory. Dr. Carter found old journals detailing the doctor's experiments. The doctor had believed that the human soul could be trapped within the walls of a house using a combination of sound waves and electromagnetic fields. He had tested his theories on unsuspecting patients, and when they died, their consciousness, or what was left of it, became trapped in the walls, creating the whispers. Dr. Carter entered the house one final time, armed with equipment to measure electromagnetic activity. As the whispers began, his instruments went haywire, detecting spikes of energy that shouldn't have been possible. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and the whispers turned into deafening screams. In the end, Dr. Carter managed to disrupt the energy field using a high-frequency sound device, silencing the whispers for good. But as he left the house, he swore he heard one final whisper: "We're still here." Today, the site of the House of Echoes is overgrown with weeds, and the townsfolk avoid it at all costs. But on quiet nights, when the moon is full, some say you can still hear faint whispers coming from the ruins. And if you listen closely, you might hear your name. As of now, no body or any trace of Eliza or those teenagers are found. Their existence is still unknown. So, if you ever find yourself near an old, abandoned house and you hear whispers in the walls, run. Because once the walls know your name, they'll never let you go.